Hey, how's everybody doing today? It's a beautiful but cold Saturday, and I'm working. So, although I don't really consider this work, this is more of a side passion or side hobby that I enjoy. And this is a special episode for me. I haven't posted in about a week, and the reason why that is because I've been doing some research on the city of Baltimore, not only a former hometown to me, but a stone's throw away. I live in Baltimore County now. Drive by the city damn near every day. Love the city. Love the sports teams, the Ravens, the Orioles. Love the culture of the city. So much so that I built the entire image of my company, Bay Life Brokerage, around the beautiful culture of Maryland and in our biggest city, Baltimore. I wanted to do a multi-piece story. It's got to be a multi-piece story because there's just so much information to give on the essentially downfall of Baltimore, the destruction of Baltimore as we see it. I don't know what other words to use for it. And based on every metric that you could find, it's a city that is declining. And it's sad to say so, but I don't think it's irreversible. And I'm hoping that putting out information regarding its history and what's going on now can maybe mandate a change in that area. I think most people have either heard of the story that hit the news recently. Tucker Carlson did a big story on it about the educational issues in the Baltimore school system. Namely, the headline was essentially that there were high school students who could not effectively pass a reading level of a kindergartner. I think there was something like 60% weren't able to read past a kindergarten level, and then another large percentage couldn't get past the second grade level. It was some ridiculous stat that effectively was showing how just rotten the Baltimore City school system was. And I've heard, and living in the city, living around the city, and being just someone who follows closely economic news and financial news and news in general. Of course, we hear all the time about the crime issues in Baltimore. This is one of the, I won't say few, but this is one of the less heard about stories as far as the education goes. And I wanted to see, what is going on here between damn near every story I hear in any major publication is a negative story about Baltimore. Um, and I love the city, and being so that I love economics, I wanted to combine the two and see if I could dwindle down to some answers. So I started looking into the history of Baltimore to see how it got where it's at today and what just how bad the situation is. And it's, as you can imagine, not a great picture. But let's start at the beginning here, right? So, and I say beginning. Baltimore's a city that's 300 something years old. So I'm not going to start back in the 1700s, but where I will start is where the industrialization of Baltimore started really turning into a place where blacks, whites, and people of all races wanted to congregate and raise their families. And this kind of climax in the 1950s. There were almost 1 million people in Baltimore by 1960. And that's hard to imagine because you compare Baltimore now to where it's at now as far as population, and we're I think just around 550 million. Or I'm sorry, 550,000. So we're almost half the population we were 70 years ago. And that statistic in itself, the way we've declined in population, the amount of people that the city is losing a year is that's a bad sign in itself as far as the signs of the decline goes. And it's kind of scary because eventually, if you lose so many people, the city will just cease to function. And so looking at the time period where we were at our climax as far as population and just growth, economic, financially, population wise, this was a time where industry ruled Baltimore. Baltimore was like the number 3 manufactured goods region in the country, and mainly due to the fact that they sit right on the Chesapeake Bay, and they were able to use the Chesapeake waterways as a way to become a major import hub, and we still are a major import hub. But at the time, there was all kinds of manufacturing industries built around these imports of raw materials, and the jobs were very plentiful, so people followed the jobs to the city. Around that time, the population of Baltimore was nowhere like it is now. It was about 65% white, and the majority of the city was white. Not as many blacks were living in the city, but it was still quite mixed. Most cities were like this at the time, and people were just following jobs. And at the time, we're talking about obviously deep segregation issues, deep second-class citizenship issues for blacks that were living in America at the time, and so these industrial jobs in the city were really good jobs for black people, blue-collar jobs for white people, and the access obviously at the time to both commerce, the economy, access to funding, access to education, access to just public utilities at the time was all heavily being regulated, and usually in some sort of way less ideal for black people than it was for white people. And so the black people living in the city at the time normally lived in segregated areas of the city, historically black neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods at the time, because of the amount of jobs in the area, were not necessarily impoverished. They weren't even any more impoverished than white neighborhoods. Everybody was essentially working for the same companies. Of course, the average, because of the systemic racism in place at the time, the average black family was making less in median income, but still, there weren't as many that were within the poverty rate compared to Baltimore now as a black majority city where we have 22.4% of our citizens living in poverty. To compare that to the national average of 13.4%, right? So right now, black majority homes in Baltimore are almost double the poverty rate of the national average. At the time of the the industrial height, these 1960s, 50s era, we saw a public policy being instituted from the federal government by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You hear about this a lot, the idea of redlining, where these black majority neighborhoods were essentially being designated as high-risk investment areas. So not only would it make it very difficult for black families to receive loans to purchase their own homes in these neighborhoods, or outside of these neighborhoods, mainly outside of these neighborhoods, but it would also make it difficult for anybody to want to invest in these neighborhoods. These were all given high risk investment designations, high risk for loan operations, and therefore, of course, property values were lower in black neighborhoods, and of course higher therefore in white neighborhoods that were given much better risk grades as far as loan and investment goes. So when the industrial complex that was Baltimore and really was America at the time started shifting into the 70s and 80s towards services, further from goods, manufacturers started moving across to Asia and down south of the border. White people tended to leave with it. They had the education in place to be able to shift from working many of these blue-collar jobs to being able to then follow the service route that America was starting to turn towards, away from goods, more to services, professional services. And they had the loan opportunities to be able to move out of the city. People were, banks, corporations were willing to lend white people money far more often than they were people who were living in these majority black neighborhoods in the city. So as the jobs left, the white people left with them, and the black people had no choice but to stay and make do. And so you want to talk about systemic racism. I think a lot of people will, get bristled at the idea that there's systemic racism going on right now in America today. And I think the term is probably just being misused. I think today people are experiencing prejudice, subconscious or conscious prejudice. These are thoughts that are affecting how people act, speak, and behave around people of certain racial groups that they may have incorrect beliefs about, ignorant beliefs about. And these are affecting their actions. These are affecting the way that they think about these groups of people. And this is the majority of what's happening today. But these thoughts that we're experiencing now, these thoughts that we watch people have about, stereotypes about certain racial groups, these have roots in systemic racism. All this came from times where there were actual laws, actual regulations, actual barriers to entry for blacks, expressly stated. And this was all throughout the country. This isn't just the South. There was almost an entirely national secondary economy made for black people that, of course, was less efficient, had far less access, and really had far less capital than the white markets. And to think that this doesn't have a compounding effect over time is just silly. And there may not be any laws or rules on the books now, but the ones that were on the books then have directly led to the destruction of our inner city, our black majority inner cities, and why black people tend to get trapped in these impoverished inner city areas. It directly has roots to both redlining, racial systemic regulations, Jim Crow rules and laws, and prejudicial thoughts that the majority white corporation institution owners had, not just then, but now. That part has not gone away. The rules may have gone away, the laws may have gone away, we may have more protections in place, but the thoughts have not gone away. And we're talking about not that long of a time for the thoughts to really even have faded. We're talking about maybe 1 or 2 generations. And 1 or 2 generations before that, we actually had black people enslaved. So we're not talking about that span of a long time. And this stuff all has compounding effects. And so when you talk about systemic racism, you have people who are right now say, oh, well, show me where it is. Well, we're not necessarily talking about the system still being racist at the moment. We're talking about the prejudices that resulted from when the system was systemically racist, and the very real measurements, the very real metrics that we can trace the lasting effects of those rules and laws, not just psychologically and subconsciously, but physical, actual home ownership rates, actual poverty rates, actual access to health care. These are things that we can measure that are direct results from systemic racism. And so people would like to forget. It can't be forgotten because that's why Baltimore is where it's at now. And this is a city that obviously hits close to home. And by every metric, it is a underperforming city. And it is a black majority owned city. We have a black mayor. We have a black police commissioner. We have a black city council president. We have a black district attorney. We have a widely black police force. So the racism part of it at this point is far less involved in, although it is heavily involved in the foundation, it's far less involved in the current management, or should I say mismanagement, of the financial resources that the city says they'd like to spend and implement to make these changes. So going back to kind of the beginning, the foundation here of where things led to this point, white people started leaving the city. In the 60s and 70s, the industry left. White people left with it. The city slowly lost people in general. The rest of Maryland started suburbanizing. Baltimore County started suburbanizing. Basically, white people had access to loans, funds that were able to get them out to the county, get them in these service jobs, and fewer black people did. On top of this, because of the systemic racist policies that segregated both in education but quality of education, many of the blacks didn't have the ability, educationally wise, to even attain certain service jobs. If they could make it past the psychological prejudice of many of the white management that were white owners and white management of these major of the workforce, they'd still have to deal with the fact that they're usually underqualified or not qualified because they didn't have access to proper education, and usually have to do about twice the amount of work when they do to be able to actually stack up to their white competitors. So this is called white flight, right? When white people leave the city, leaving black people behind and impoverished, less this is a classic story that's played out through many cities across America: St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, in many ways. This is not a Baltimore only story, and it's had its lasting effect. The current Baltimore unemployment rate is 7.9%. Right, so we're talking about a U.S. average of 6%. So we're well above that. The majority of the Baltimore people are either receiving some kind of assistance, financial assistance from the state, or they are in many ways not confident in the salaries and wages that they're making to be able to continue to sustain their family, living check to check. We do have a 62% labor force participation rate, which right now is better than the national average. But the household income is $41,000. The U.S. average household income is $53,000. So the average Baltimore household income, which we know the average Baltimorean is black, the average median household income is about $12,000 less than the U.S. average. So the jobs that they do have, although the participation rate is higher, the jobs that they do have pay much less. The average income per person in Baltimore is about $25,000 compared to the U.S. average of $28,000. So it's in every metric our people are behind. And this is something that is just, we want to talk about rife through the entire system. We heard about the educational issues. There's employment issues. I want to say the average income is so much lower, possibly due to the fact that there's higher taxes, there's a higher income tax. But that doesn't explain it all, because there's just fewer, I think there's also just fewer jobs, fewer well-paying jobs, and fewer well-educated people to fulfill the higher paying jobs. The future job growth projections don't look good either. And the research that I was doing showed that there isn't a lot in the upcoming budget to kind of improve any of the things that I'm going to go over here. The job growth is predicted right now to be about 25%, and the average in the U.S. is 33%. So I think much of the administration would probably point towards COVID and all these different things as to why our metrics look so terrible. And I'm sure those do have some very serious lasting effects, but the rest of the nation is dealing with that also. And so that's kind of a cop-out in my eyes. also the majority of our jobs in the city are built around the healthcare industry. So you would think that the healthcare industry would see somewhat of a boom, and therefore Baltimore would see somewhat of a, at least less impactful job numbers, considering we just went through this pandemic. But you haven't seen that at all. The schools are getting worse and worse. Crime is getting worse and worse. And the outlook for the city as a whole is getting worse and worse. We talked about the foundation of how we got here. These are some of the, we talked about some of the numbers of how things look at the moment. And in my future videos, I want to talk about specifically what the school system looks like, and specifically what the crime, the policing ideas to fix the crime, what those look like. I can tell you they're not great and there's not much, but I want to go into it. I want anybody who has any other information as far as something they feel to add to this conversation. I would love to hear it. I'm certainly not an expert. This is just through the research that I've been able to do the past week. That's why I haven't posted. I've just been researching kind of the foundation of how Baltimore got to this point and what we can do moving forward, what's going on in the schools, what's going on in the justice system. Of course, from an economical standpoint, because I think that's what this all comes down to. Everything that you're hearing in the news, poor education, poor access to health care, higher health care risks, higher crime, these are all symptoms of poverty. That's it. It's not a black thing. It's not a minority thing. It's not an urban thing, which is usually a code word. You could be a majority people of a purple race living in cities like this, and if the same story played out in the same way, we'd be talking about purple people at higher risk for COVID, and purple people at higher risk for poverty and less educated areas. It's got nothing to do with race, except the roots of it, right? I mean, it had everything to do with race. But what I'm saying is that you put any person through what majority of black people have had to go through the generations of this country. You put them through that same machine, that same system, you're going to end up, I don't care, like I said, what color you actually are, you're going to end up in having these same effects every time. And it's really a shame, and it's really sad. And at this point now, however, you have people that are being voted into office who are taking advantage of the fact that black people want change, that people in the city want change. You have people taking advantage of the fact that things are always looking so bad that you're the one to promise to do things differently, and then you don't at all. And we've seen this for many decades. People are taking advantage of the fact that the numbers look bad so that they can come in and say they're going to be the one, and they never are. The corruption and the mismanagement in the city is going to be the focus of the next few videos. The corruption in the school system and the corruption in the criminal justice system. And these are things that are happening now. The past is what the past was, and it set us up to be where we're at now. But the mismanagement and the corruption going on now is why we're staying where we're at, is why the city is continuing to decline and declining at a faster rate. And I'm hoping that just starting the conversation about this could possibly force a change in some way. So again, I'd love any other information anybody feels they could provide. I'd love to have it, so I can include it in some of the information I'm talking about and discussing in these videos. I hope everybody has a good weekend. It is a beautiful day. Go downtown if you get a chance. If you feel safe enough to do so. Visit some of the aquariums. I think they've got the new Jurassic Park thing going on at Baltimore County Fairgrounds. And try to enjoy the day. I know it's cold, but that's Maryland, right? So anyways, I'll be on next week to go more into this topic. Appreciate any feedback, and please subscribe if you appreciate the content and feel that these are things worth talking about.